All right, you guys, welcome to JavaScript to Know for React episode 1. And in this video, we're just going to do a quick overview of all the basic things that you would need to know to be successful as a JavaScript developer, and by extension of that, as a React developer. So if you don't know what JavaScript is, if you don't know what React is, this is not going to be a tutorial that's going to go super deep into detail when it comes to that, but you will get a general understanding of what these things are. So let's just jump right into it. So in order to be successful at React, you don't need to know every single thing in JavaScript. And I think this is a mistake that a lot of people make when they are learning programming for the first time. You can get lost in just the sheer magnitude of all the different things that you can do with a particular language. And so there's usually two kinds of people. There's people that don't go far enough, and there's people that get caught up in things that don't really matter. So to be successful as a computer engineer means just knowing the best techniques, the fastest techniques, and the most efficient techniques to do your job. So JavaScript, for everyone who doesn't know, is just a language originally built for the web browser, but in recent years, we can now use JavaScript in the web browser and on the server, and that's where technologies like Node.js and Express come in at. So JavaScript is interacting with the HTML, the hypertext markup language, which is what gives your application life. It makes your application and your website interactive. So where does React come into this equation? Well, React is just a library built on top of JavaScript that's just a little more robust than raw JavaScript. So what you're looking at on the right of your screen is raw JavaScript, and this is how we will write what we call vanilla JavaScript, right? So what we have here at the top, we have three variables. One's a button, one's an input, and one's an unordered list. And what we do is we call the DOM to create those elements, and we store them in variables. We have a function which doesn't do anything except return a number. And then we have a list element function, which takes an element which is in list, and we add a value to that list as a blank string. After that, we say, hey, if anybody hasn't clicked yet, then we want to add another element to that DOM tree. And then if there's an event key press on the keyboard, then we want to create another element as well. And then we add some event listeners to track what the user is doing when they click and when they press a button. So that's a lot of code, right, written out. And that's why React was created. So you wouldn't have to try to figure out 30 lines of code when you could really do this in a much beautiful way to write. So let's move on to some of the basic things you need to know for React. You need to understand template literals. And if you are coming from, a beginner's perspective, then you probably have just learned what basic data types are, what strings are, what arrays are, what objects are. And this is taking strings a step further. That way, our code is easier to read and understand. So what you're looking at here is a vanilla JavaScript way of using template literals. And what we have here is just an object with two properties, a name and a website. And what we want to do is console.log, which means we want to show in our browser console a name and the website. And so instead of putting in strings with quotes inside of our console log statement, we're using backticks. And when we want to reference a particular string value, we use a $ and an open parenthesis. And that's the same thing that's happening down here. They are console.logging 19 plus 2. And instead of typing in strings, we're using backticks. So the only difference is you use backticks instead of quotes at the beginning and the end. And you also, when you're referencing a string value, you want to use a $ and parentheses. So here's a more React way of looking at what we just looked at. We wouldn't have to use the object syntax. We would just create a function that returns a string, create two variables, name and food, create another variable called sentence, which takes in a string And that string is referenced here when we have our backticks and we have our $sign in our parentheses, which reference the name and the food. All right, so the next thing you need to know in JavaScript for React is arrow functions. So this whole idea of arrow functions has to do with two different programming ideas. Do we want to explicitly return things, or do we want to implicitly return things? So when we explicitly return something, we actually write the word return. That is what an explicit return is. When we want to implicitly return something, we don't use the return statement, but it's implied from our logic that we are returning something from a function. So arrow functions are anonymous functions, meaning that they don't need to be named. They're shorthand, and they save you a lot of time in writing. And you're going to use a lot of implicit and explicit return statements in your code, and arrow functions just make that easier. So here's an example of an arrow function in ES6 and ES5. So ES6, ECMAScript 6, came out in 2016, and it's actually, a pretty standard way of writing JavaScript at this point. And of course, we've continued to go further and go further. But if you look at how we used to write code with ES5, we would create, a variable, and we would write a for loop, and we would follow this algorithm of saying, look, we want to start at 0 as long as I is less than the length of our array. We want to add 1. That's what the I++ does. And then we would return an additional name to every index above 0 inside our pet names array. So that's a lot of code to do something very simple, right? So with ES6, we have a way to return something without having to add all of that additional code. And that's where the arrow function comes in at. So next, we want to talk about ternary operators. What are ternary operators? So typically in JavaScript, as well as other programming languages, when you want to try different conditions, you typically would use an if statement. So the example that you're looking at here is a function that says try if else, and it takes in an input, and it says, hey, the input is less than 10, or if it's less than 9, counts the log input is less than 9, and so on and so forth, all the way to 7. And we have an else statement which says, hey, if it's none of those, then the import is more than 8 or more than 9 or more than 10. So again, this can get very complicated, right? When you're writing code, you want to think about writing something that's easy for you to understand and also easy for other people to understand. And so instead of writing a bunch of if and else statements inside of our code, inside of React, if we want to have some conditional logic, in this case, we have a button which wants to say, hey, if the button has been clicked and toggled, then we want to show a particular component, which is going to say, hey, this condition 1 has been met. So that is where ternary operators come in at. They're very, very useful and very, very sleek inside of our code, especially when writing React components that need to change based on some sort of condition. So what we have here is, if first is true, right? If that state is true, then we want to show condition 1. If first is true is not true, then we want to render our condition 2 component. So this just saves us so much effort inside of thinking about what we're looking at, and it helps us think about conditions in our React code a lot more succinctly as engineers. Next, we want to talk about a very, very key thing that you're going to do over and over and over again. It's destructuring arrays, props, and objects. So one of the things that you'll learn in the beginning of your journey, whether you're learning computer science or doing some sort of coding bootcamp, is structuring objects, how to create an array, how to create an object with properties, how to call some of those properties and methods. So what we end up having to do a lot in React and in web development in general is we have to destructure structures. So we have to take things off these different structures that are there and then do something with them. So what you're looking at here is a plain vanilla JavaScript way of destructuring objects. So what we have here is an object called person, with two properties, first name and last name, and those properties have a value of Joe and Appleseed. So we wanted to use those two properties as one property. Then we could destructure those two properties off of the person object. Same thing with arrays. So arrays are another common data structure that you're going to always run into inside of JavaScript and other programming languages as well. And let's say we have an array that has two values, A and B, and we want to take those values and store them in a variable so we can use them somewhere else. And lastly, we have a destruction for of loop. So we have an array with two values, and we say for each index and element of this, all the entries in this array, we want to take an index and an element. Now, here's a more modern usage of this in React. So we used to have to destructure our props very differently in React in the past. You'll see a lot of older examples of people saying, you know, const emojify component equals props, and then up underneath that inside the function, you are selecting two values and setting them equal to props. Well, we don't have to do that anymore. We can just destructure whatever properties we need directly right there in the middle of the function. And so all we're doing is destructuring these two values, and then we can call these values directly in our code. The next thing you need to know for JavaScript basics for React is the spread operator. So the spread operator is often used in combination with destructuring. So everything that I'm teaching in this video is just showing you patterns, and a lot of these patterns go together. And so a lot of times when you're using a spread operator, you have some sort of destructuring going on, because the spread operator is helping you copy an array or object into another array object or a variable. So JavaScript spread versus REST operator example. So what you have been looking at on the left is how we usually would, you know, in the old days, get a particular value off of an array. So we have a function which takes in a parameter first, and it's going to copy some parameters from an others object. And we're going to say for every index that's less than 1, we're going to iterate over that until we get to the end of it. Okay, so the REST operator is a collector, and it collects the rest of the parameters that we need. The spread operator helps us expand a single variable into more. So the spread operator allows us to copy whatever we have and to add on to it. And that's where it becomes very powerful. So here's another example of the spread operator versus how you can do it in just plain JavaScript. So you're trying to find the minimum value of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and you're just calling the min function, and you have to pass all of those things in. With the spread operator, you can store your values in a variable, call the same argument, min off the math function, and then just spread over every single value that's in the numbers array. And this is just a much more readable way of understanding exactly what we're doing with our data and our code. Some of the most common problems in JavaScript or React, for that matter, will be solved with the map method. So the map method allows us to iterate over multiple objects and get particular values off of those objects. So in this example, we have, let's just say we have a list of books, and we want to show certain information about every book. So we want to show a name, author, genre, and the year the book was published. So instead of writing a for statement and saying, hey, for each variable I equals 0, I is less than books.length, I plus plus, all the way from 0 to the end of the array, we can just map by passing in a key and optionally an index. So the map method takes a callback function along with an index and a key, but all you really need is the key or the index by itself, and then that will allow you to extract that particular value that you want off of that group of books. So here's another example of, let's say we had an array called person details structured in JSON inside of our code. And let's just say we wanted to get all the names off of our person details array. So that map method would allow us to focus in on a particular value that we want off of that array, and that particular value that we want in this case is the name. So if you understand that, then you'll be good to go in JavaScript and React. Another important method that's the basis of a lot of patterns in React is the reduce method. So the reduce method allows you to take two values and return a particular value from those two values, right? So what we have here is we are passing values from an object to an array. So we have an object to array, which is set equal to an object, which returns some keys, right, which receive an object, and then we reduce two values, an index, which is called accumulator, and a key. We then spread over the accumulator, meaning we get the value of it, and then we also return that along with the object, the key and the value and the index of the object, and then we pass in an empty array. And then once we've done that, then we can pass in additional values inside our console.log. So this is just raw JavaScript, and it's much more robust than this. But for now, you can start thinking about this as state in React. And you can start thinking about, let's say we have multiple states in React, and we need to limit what type of state we want our user to see inside of our website. And that's where the reducer pattern is going to come in at. All right, another very, very key method is the filter method. So, I mean, every website is using some sort of filtering. And what we have here is an example of a React component that allows you to filter over names. And so when you type in a name here inside this input, then you can use the map method and the argument for the map method to filter whatever names match the input. And so we do that with a filter method, which takes in a callback, an index value, and then we just say everything that we want to return needs to include this particular value. And that's why those props are destructured there. So this example right here is really good because it shows you kind of like a combination of all these patterns in one. It's showing you how to destructure props. So we have a function called name picker, which destructures name and search value. Then we have a variable called filter names, which takes the names, filters an entry over them, and that has to include that search value. And then we map a list of every entry by ID. Another basic thing that you want to know is the nullish coalescing operator. This is something that's a little new. So the nullish coalescing operator allows you to filter out null and undefined values. And you might say, well, why would I want to do that? Well, a lot of times when you're writing something or you're coding, you don't want a null or undefined value. You want something that the user can see and respond to. And so these double question marks allows you to say, hey, is foo null or is it a string? And so we are going to console log foo, and then we should see foo fighter. So that way there's no values being passed into our function or our code. Here's another example, which is saying essentially, as long as it's other than null or undefined, then we want to return something, or if it is null or undefined, then we want to return B. And the last thing, and this is probably the most important thing, one of the more important topics, I should say, definitely in the top 3, is understanding promises and understanding the async await syntax. So before we had this async await syntax, we just had promises, and this async await syntax can be used in combination with promises or without it. So promise chains are asynchronous, but the difference is only the promise chain itself is asynchronous, meaning that the outside code, the closure, the function that is running in is not necessarily asynchronous. With async await, our entire wrapper function is asynchronous, and asynchronous just means that it needs to wait for something to come back. So promise chain synchronous work can be handled in the same callback. In async await, synchronous work needs to be moved out of the callback. Multiple promises use promise.all, and async await, multiple promises can be handled with simple variables, and they both use the same logic for error handling, except the then versus the try. So promises are going to use then, and async await is going to use try when it's trying to follow up on a function return value, and then it's going to catch whatever value that you get, and then the final value will say this is what my last value is. So here's a very common example that is very, very modern and definitely a good example for somebody to start with. So in React, we have React hooks, and let's say we are making an API request to some API to get some data, and we need to wait for it a little bit so that we can track a response and log it to our console. So because we know we need to wait on something to come back, we're going to pass in an arrow function, and that arrow function is going to return an object, and inside of that object is an asynchronous function which takes in a couple variables, a URL and some configuration, and then it also has a response. And then we have a function that's going to show that our response is asynchronous, so we pass in the await keyword before our function along with our two variables, and then we console log our response. Here's another quick example of something that you'll see maybe if you're dealing with some form of middleware, which we'll talk about in another video. But again, we pass it a parameter, and then we return an asynchronous function, and it can take several values. It could take a request, a response, and a next parameter, and then we're going to try to find each user and find all of our documents, and then we're going to store it in an array and catch any errors. And so this is useful, like I said, if you know that you have something that's making some sort of request or that's waiting on some sort of response from an API, an async await syntax is going to be very, very powerful for you as a developer. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this short video, and I will see you in the next one.